So without further ado, I'll get started. This is the overview, just to make sure that you are interested in what I'm about to talk to. This should line up with the abstract that we sent out. So I'm going to cover briefly is what is enterprise architecture and why we need it, what's the use of enterprise architecture. I will briefly talk about the Fragile to Agile Enterprise Architecture Framework, and I'm going to give you a quick overview of that. And it drives the rest of the presentation because I will use that framework to describe the difference between an enterprise architecture and a solution architect. There's a danger that you might think that this is a commercial pitch as a result, but I promise you it isn't intended that way. I actually, long before ever launched this as a commercial thing, would have been given exactly the same presentation. I'm given it formerly the Chief Architect of the Australian Tax Office, the Chief Architect of Benny and Adelaide Bank, before we ever launched this as a commercial company, and those organisations have adopted this framework and are using it as well as corporations subsequent. I'll then talk about the difference between enterprise architecture and solution architecture, the discipline, and the role of an enterprise architecture and a solution architect. Because in my view, I put in the abstract, some of the confusion and angst that's caused is over the lack of clarity between those two things. How EAs and SAs for shorthand, because I'm going to be saying it an awful lot given the title of the presentation. I'm going to start using EA and SA throughout for that, just take it as enterprise architect and solution architect and save my voice an awful lot. I know I'm going to be saying those two terms 1,000 times tonight. I'll be looking at how EAs and SAs can work together more effectively. I'll take you through some sample enterprise architecture artifacts and show how those artifacts then flow on to be used in solution architecture by the solution architects. I'll give you a list of the SA artifacts, but because of timing today, I probably won't have time to go through any detail on solution architecture artifacts. Then talk about a key issue which everybody talks about these days in the field, architecture governance, in particular how we can embed different governance and how you work with these frameworks and approaches. For those of you who are using the two other major enterprise architecture frameworks out there, Zachman and TOGAF, the people who are using Zachman or TOGAF, these two or three. And what I've discussed tonight, what implications that has for people who are adopting Zachman and TOGAF and using those two particular frameworks. And I'll give you a quick summary and any questions we have at the end. So if that doesn't interest you, feel free to leave if you've come to the wrong presentation, but that's what we're going to cover tonight. So let's start. What is architecture? I mean generically architecture, not specifically enterprise or solution architecture. First and most important thing is it's about overall design and how the individual pieces fit together. It is not getting into the detailed design of how those individual components work. That is an engineering discipline, as a solution or software engineering discipline is not the role of enterprise architecture or solution architecture. Architecture is how everything fits together, and what the correct modularization or componentization is required is not how you actually build the individual components, and is not an enterprise architecture function. And the role, most importantly, it's a noun and a verb. And most people think of enterprise architecture and they think of a whole pile of pictures or enterprise architecture pictures. That's important, yes, you have to have the enterprise architecture artifacts, but most importantly, it is actually a discipline which has a process that we do to do enterprise architecture, as similar to solution architecture. The role depends on the scope. You know, it could be an individual building, a whole complex of buildings, or an entire city. Depending on, you're using this sort of traditional civil engineering analogy for this. And the larger the scope, the more we need to focus on architecture. So, you know, just as if you were building a little shed out in the back garden, architecture is probably not important. If you're designing a new city, you better start thinking about architecture. If you're designing a shopping centre or the opera house, then you also, yeah, so that's going to go off. You know what I mean? Enterprise architecture is often equated to city planning, and it's a reasonable analogy. Enterprise architecture is about designing the overall city and how it works. It's not about designing individual pieces of it. So at the first sort of analogy I'll give you for the difference between an enterprise architecture and a solution architect, aligning with those analogies, is an enterprise architect is a city town planner. A solution architect is more analogous to a direct architect in the civil engineering sense of what we would call an architect. And then a software engineer is equivalent to a civil engineer, who actually does the engineering design, making sure the beams are actually strong enough to hold the building, and all those type of engineering level disciplines is pretty much analogous to software engineering. So what is enterprise architecture specifically? This is our definition. There are probably as many definitions of enterprise architecture as there are people working in the field, which is a problem in its own right. that everybody has a slightly different view of what it is. IBM, being IBM, definition runs to about 10 pages. They can't keep themselves to a really short, sharp, and sweet. My favourite one outside of ours, which is obviously clear, is Gartner's. Gartner's is a very good technical definition. It's about a paragraph, and it's got a very detailed technical definition of what is in scope for enterprise architecture. I really like that one. But it doesn't really resonate with CEOs or people on the business. Show them the Gartner definition and you'll lose them completely. So we like to keep it simple, as I say, KISS definition of enterprise architecture. And it's really about alignment. At its core, enterprise architecture is about alignment. It's about aligning your business design, your people design, which often gets forgotten in these things. Humans have to interact with these systems and solutions and deal with them, and your technology design. So that together, and only by our view, together they're all aligned, can you truly deliver on business intent. And the other part of that implies that your architecture is driven by business intent. Freestanding architecture that isn't actually attached to what your business wants to achieve is dangerous. Ivory tower architecture that doesn't have any connection with what you're trying to achieve. Architectures is different for each organization depending on what they want to achieve. You compete on customer service, you'll have a certain type of architecture. If you compete on cost and price, it's a different architecture for you. If you compete on product, slightly different architecture is required. So there is no way you can universally just say here's an architecture and drop it into an organization. It must be tied back to what they're actually trying to achieve. So, why do we need it? And this is a fairly self-serving story about enterprise architecture, but it's also an entertaining one, I'm sure one. Again, using the analogy of house. Has anyone heard about Winchester House? There's 2 or 3, but there's quite a few people that's new to. True story, but the heiress to the Winchester rifle fortune went slightly bonkers towards the end of her life, and was utterly convinced that all the ghosts of anyone who'd been shot by her grandfather's rifles were out together. And her response to that was to continually change the internals of her house so they couldn't find her. So she'd wake up every morning and decide to the builders, no, move this one over there, no, I'll have that wall over there, no, I'll have this room over here. And proceeded to do that for the last 6 years of her life. And obviously with no architecture, just waking up and saying, give me one of that and do one of that. For those in IT, you probably have to react to those sort of requests from the business constantly. And constantly changing their mind from day to day. Well, that's fine. But the outcome of that is one of the bizarrest houses ever. I mean, if her outcome was to build a world-class tourist attraction, which I'd actually attended at the time, she succeeded. But it's just outside San Diego, and it's absolutely fabulous to be able to see their walls. Rooms are completely blocked off, you can't get to now, fireplaces with no chimneys. You can lie down on this big, useful double bed and look up and see the glass starlight bar for the window thing that goes through, and it just goes up to a bed above you. Yes, John?
In San Jose.
San Jose, just near San Diego. Oh, sorry, San Jose. San Francisco, I didn't say, not San Diego. But my favourite one is this gravity-defying plumbing. In one of those lovely stories you like to hear, to create an IT context, if you like, you can build IT systems with no users. You do whatever you like. Because towards the tail end, the builders have figured out that she was never going to use any of this stuff, so it didn't matter if it worked. So the sink actually has this pipe coming out the bottom and going across and then going straight up into the roof. Like that was never going to work from an engineer perspective. Look, I guess you got the point, right? It is obviously a self-serving story. We never do this with our colleagues. But we continue to do it at IT, expecting it to work. And what we end up with is a furball. We end up with IT systems that are held together by band-aids, or you know what I mean, by a furball that cats just throw it, and it's all held together. But somebody starts pulling strings out, and God knows what will happen. And nobody really understands how it works anymore. It's far too complex and intertwined. Final point, if you don't think it's important, some unfortunately very sobering statistics for our industry, and I won't read through them all because it depresses me every time I look at them. But I make this point simply to make the point that continuing as we are is not an option. We've got to do something in our industry to get better. We can't continue to have such horrific statistics, or we'll end up being used car salesmen of the 21st century if we aren't already in people's lives. So we need to do something. So this is the Agile Enterprise Architecture Framework. And I have to say that the website has a detailed breakdown of what each of these things are. I couldn't go through it in great detail today. We won't run out of time very rapidly. But broadly, you've got domains of design down here, which are broken into 4 categories we discussed: business intent, business design, people design, and technology design. So if you look within technology design, you've got integration architecture, security architecture, communications and network architecture, infrastructure. These are all the different domains of design within technology. Within business design, user pathway analysis, business process design, etc. So these are the domains of design that we need to cover when you're designing a system, or strategically. And then going across the top, walking in front of it there, we've got strategic design, where you're actually doing your overall organizational design, your conceptual design for solutions, and then you go into logical or detailed design, and then finally delivery. And critically, the same framework supports all four, start to finish. And that's one of the core differentiators, I think, of this approach, is that exactly the same framework and process can be used by all disciplines involved from start to finish. And there's some significant advantages right out of the box, so to speak, for everybody operating on the same base framework. Not restrictive in any of these. Any organization can pick and choose which pieces that they wish to fill, and both in terms of the actual artifacts or the processes that they use to deliver that. Doing a piece of work at NAB, for example, and we got started yet, and we signed up for it. And when they went through, they're looking at our conceptual design approach, and they said, we think we're pretty good at process design. We've had people in for ages helping us become experts in process design. Well, fine. We continue to use your technique for that, but we'll help you with some of the others. Some of these we don't do ourselves. You'll see a little bit while later. And we've got people who we recommend that we get involved. We don't cover the entire space. We don't do any infrastructure architecture, for example. So let's do that framework, that base framework, to explore the difference between enterprise architecture, the discipline, and enterprise architecture at all. Sorry, there is one other point I want to make there. So I did check my notes. The other thing is that it inherently supports the noun. I mentioned right at the start about enterprise architecture, the noun and the verb. So the noun is simply a matter of saying that you have to have one of these. Some of them might not apply to you, so you can drop layers out. For example, if you outsource all development, the solution development architecture is probably not interest to you. I don't really care what somebody is if you're going to outsource all development. But it also supports the verb inherently. This order is not arbitrary, it's important. You transverse them in this order. What is the business intent we are trying to achieve? What are the financial outcomes, customer, partner outcomes we are trying to achieve? Okay, user pathway analysis first. What does that mean for how customers are going to interact with us? Put ourselves in the customer's shoes and see what their user pathway will be. All right, what capabilities do we need to support that pathway? What processes, etc. And then you get down up to what technology is needed to support it. Now, I'm not saying that you don't iteratively use this as a positive feedback. There's no reason you can't get down here and say, oh, actually, we've got a very good technology solution down here that will help you. So it is, you should try and make it as an 80% pass first through, and then loop around and see are there any improvements you can make here based upon some of those things you've got down here. The other important thing is there's no tail wagging the dog here. Okay? Business drives, people drives IT, not the other way around. Fundamental to our belief structure. Business drives IT.